Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whatever time you're watching this. I hope you're having a good day. So we're going to cover humanism in this lecture, an intro to humanism, and we're not quite going to get to the spread of humanism during the Renaissance. So what you are going to be required to answer is questions 1 through 5 from your unit handout, these questions right here. So as I'm going through the lecture, your job is to just, when you hear the answer those questions. Alright, let's get started. I'm going to have you do a quick warm-up in a second. Then we're going to do a quick review, and then we'll get into the lecture. So your warm-up is this. I want you to jot down some notes. What is the ideal 21st century man and woman? What do they look like? So in your chart here, created on your own sheet of paper, what are the ideal qualities of what society tells us a man should have today? I'm talking everything like looks, personality, skills, etc. And then the same thing for a woman. So take some time, take a minute, stop the lecture, and fill in at least, let's say, 5 to 8 ideas about what makes a man and woman the ideal person today. Alright, we'll use that chart next class. And we'll talk about it at the beginning of class. So, quick Renaissance review. Number 1, off the top of your head, say them out loud. You don't have to write these on your paper. Where did the Renaissance begin? Italian city-states, correct. Where specifically? Florence, correct. Who did the Renaissance humanists admire and look to and then study? If you're thinking the classics, the writers of ancient Greece and Rome, you are correct, the classics. What era did most humanists despise? They began to think the Dark Ages were a time for a lack of knowledge, and they abandoned the classics. What did the humanists believe about the individual and individual glory? Humanists believed you could receive glory, right? It was okay to praise individual achievement. God made humans to be great. Unlike the Middle Ages, we could recognize individual achievement. And last question, number 6. What did the humanists believe about the church? Well, they still, remember this, practiced their faith. The humanists were not atheists by any sense. Atheists, for the most part, really didn't exist that we have record of. Everybody was still a person of faith, even when they challenged with new ideas, new knowledge, ideas of the Catholic Church and the Catholic faith. So that's a quick review of the Renaissance. Hope you were nailing those questions. We'll return to short answer question number 3, but so you're listening for it. You're going to describe 2 earlier humanists and their work that led to a kind of knowledge that combined individualism and religion. So we're going to look at some different humanists in this lecture and talk about how they combined both new ideas of the Renaissance, individualism, with old ideas, religion. Alright, Renaissance overview. The Renaissance lasts roughly 300 years, as historians have called it. And the important thing to remember here is not so much the dates, although they're helpful to know, but it's important to understand where it began and then where it spread to, and finally where it became most prevalent by the end of the 17th century. So it began in Italy, as we've been talking about, just like everything we've been talking about. It began in Florence, the most powerful city-state in the 1400s. And then it spread north from there. So a lot of things happened that caused artists to flee, writers to flee, different city-states, and the Renaissance began to spread to northern Europe as the ideas are spreading because artists are forced to leave Italy, and also the printing press has a big impact, which you read about. By the late 1400s, printing presses are sending out information to people throughout different parts of Europe. And by the 16th century, we see the rise of the Renaissance in England, and we get Shakespeare, who's considered potentially the greatest Renaissance writer of all. So that's considered the end of the Renaissance, the Shakespearean age in England. Humanism begins with the classics. Like we've talked about, Greece and Rome, the classics, considered the Golden Age. So writers of the Renaissance look back oftentimes even writing letters to the dead, as we're going to or have read in Letters to Livy. Humanists also studied the history. They glorified the history of ancient Rome and Greece, and there became this emphasis on the study of history, which is where we get the term humanitas, or as we call it, the humanities today, which is why history and other classes are included in your humanities education. Alright, I'm going to have you take out your isms review sheet, and I'm going to have you add all of these. So you have 4 major isms for the Renaissance that you're going to need to know: classicism, humanism, civic humanism, and northern humanism. And I'm not going to go over each one. I'll just have you pause the video and write down the importance of these and finish your isms chart for this unit. Okay, so as you have done now, you've copied these down. Humanism, we're going to go over it on the next slide, but basically humanism goes from a revival of antiquity in philosophy and literature to then applying that to politics, civic humanism, and then the northern humanist authors, they took the ideas of the Renaissance and humanism, but they applied it mainly to the church. They wanted to see church reform occur, and that will lead us into the Reformation, which we'll get to next unit. But some basics about humanism that apply to all, both Italian, civic, and northern Christian humanists. Number 1, they have a general agreement that classics provide a valuable study tool for their works. The knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome, something that could be learned from. Number 2, greater emphasis on the individual human potential than previously contained in scholasticism of the medieval period. And they rejected a lot of the previously accepted Aristotelian views, which we looked at last unit during the medieval time period. But Aristotle had basically created the groundwork for a lot of scientific ideas, and those are starting to be broken down. Writers remain religious and devout, like I said earlier. They're not atheists. They're not skeptic scientists like we think of today when we hear about people challenging the church. No, even when their works challenged the church, they still identified with the church, were devout and religious people. And the study of ancient languages, Latin and Greek, and a liberal arts education, study of multiple fields, were extremely important. All humanists agree on this, and we'll get into more later how they differ, specifically northern humanists emphasizing this idea that our knowledge should change the church. So we're going to look at a couple of artists from the early Italian humanists. Petrarch and Bruni are the 2 we're going to look at. Other artists who will mention Boccaccio, Valla, Ficino, Mirandala. So let's look at a couple of these early humanists. So Leonardo Bruni, he wrote a book called The History of Florence, and it's a great example of humanist work because it looks at the history of this great city and how it was connected to the classics in ancient Rome. He, as all humanists did, he loved the work of the Roman author Cicero, and he drew the conclusion that history has 3 parts. There was ancient Rome, the medieval period, and the modern period, which they were in then. He believed the medieval period was a time of decay, and this new modern era, Renaissance, his era, would be a new time of glory. But you have to think, at the time that he's living, he doesn't necessarily know it's the Renaissance. They're just coming up with new knowledge. Historians give it the term farther down the road, the Renaissance. Alright, Petrarch, he's considered the father of humanism. Why? If he's given the title father, what did he do? A couple of things. Number 1, he combined literature and religion in the same writings. They're not separate anymore. He saw value in literature, like Harry Potter. I see great value in Harry Potter as a religious text in a lot of sense. I mean, Harry Potter really is the Jesus of the wizarding world, if you think about it. And I think literature is beautiful, and it brings us closer to God if we look at it in a different light. So Petrarch started to do that. He said literature and religion can go together. He wrote his work, Poetry in Italian Vernacular. Vernacular means language, and the Italian vernacular was the language of the local people, not just common language of Latin. Why? Well, not everybody reads Latin anymore, so his people could read it. It's about the individual, right? So people need to be able to read your text. So that changed a lot of things, and then authors followed that. They didn't just write in Latin because that's what people used to do. They wrote in the language of their people. And he used what we're going to look at in great detail in class called critical textual analysis. And this is, this is it. If I could teach you one thing this year, I want you to be critical in how you approach the text. Why? Because people can write anything, and people can lie. Even people of authority, they'll write anything and lie, and you have to be able to decide and use evidence to decide what's truth. So that's patriarch. We're going to look at this. I'm going to skip to slide 23 right now, and in class we're going to take a look at a famous incident with a military member named Jessica Lynch. So that's what we're going to look at in class, but for now I'm going to jump ahead back to Petrarch. We will thank him in class. Other works and ideas he had: letters to Ivy, or I think I got that wrong, that might be Livy, sorry if that's the case. Imaginary dialogue with Augustine of Hippo, and Italian poetry. So he writes letters to people who passed away, famous authors from different time periods. Other ideas besides critical textual analysis: he called the period between the fall of Roman Empire and his time period the Dark Ages. And like we talked about, he wrote in the vernacular of the people. So, interpretation here: medieval, old, goodbye. Welcome to the new, the modern, the Renaissance. Other notable Italian writers: Boccaccio, he wrote a book called The Decameron. We've talked about that. And it was about a lot about the Black Plague, but also had 100 earthly tales that comprised a social commentary on 14th century Italy. Very much humanist in its approach to the world around him and what he was seeing. Alberti, he wrote a history of Florence. First, he used the term humanism and wrote boldly and boastfully of himself. We'll talk about that in the next slide. But one thing that Renaissance artists and authors start to do, because of this emphasis on the individual, they write about themselves. They brag about themselves. Like it's an interview. They're asked to brag about themselves, or they're not even asked to, they just do. Valla, he wrote another critical piece on the church. It's called On the False Donation of Constantine. And what he did is he used textual analysis to prove the church had falsified documents to gain land. Also, he was a foremost expert on the Latin language. This was a very important piece because it showed for 600 years that this document that popes were basing their claims of lands upon was actually a forged document. It was made up. Alright, our last slide here. I told you Alberti was an accomplished author, a true Renaissance man in the sense, and he's also a big bragger of himself. He wrote of himself as a virtuous Renaissance man. In other words, he bragged. He said he was devoted to the knowledge of the strange and most difficult things. He hurled the javelin, ran, leaped, and wrestled. He learned music without teachers. He was referring to himself here in the third person when he, in a book called The Great, it was something like The Great Men of Florence, and he included himself in here, which was very much captured the idea of humanist virtue, this idea that we are virtuous people and we need to capture great men of virtue, and that's what Alberti did in that work. Alright, that ends my lecture for today. I hope you got the answer to questions 1 through 5. If you did not, go back and review some things and make sure you have the answers to all of these questions. Alright, I'll see you in class tomorrow. Ciao.